What would you do if your HOA's queen bee, you know, the kind of Karen who thinks the world revolves around her, demanded that you hand over your private lake cabin for her son's prom night? Most people might cave, but in my case, my wife just happens to be the chief of police. Buckle up, because this story takes a wild turn you won't see coming. And before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss more insane real-life stories just like this one. It all started on an ordinary spring morning in our sleepy lakeside community, the kind of morning where the water glistened like glass and the only sound was the distant call of loons echoing across the shoreline. But my peace didn't last long because the phone buzzed with a number I knew all too well. The HOA President Karen, a woman with perfectly sprayed hair, oversized sunglasses, and a voice sharp enough to cut glass, and without so much as a hello she dove straight into her demand, insisting that since her son Chad had been elected prom king and deserved only the best, my wife and I should offer up our family's private lake cabin as the venue for his after-prom party. And when I told her politely but firmly that the cabin was private property and off-limits for drunken teenagers, she scoffed and reminded me that as HOA president she had influence, which was her favorite phrase. But what she didn't know was that influence means very little when your neighbor is married to the chief of police. So instead of arguing further I simply said, "Karen, it's not happening," and hung up. But that was only the beginning of what turned into one of the wildest weeks of my life, because Karen never took no for an answer. That very evening, as my wife Rachel came home in uniform, tired from her shift, I told her about Karen's call, expecting her to laugh it off, but instead she leaned against the counter, narrowed her eyes, and said, "Something tells me this isn't over," and she was right, because the very next day, Karen showed up on our porch uninvited, Chad in tow, the boy towering in his football jacket, smirking like the world owed him everything, and Karen launched into her pitch again, this time claiming that all the parents thought the cabin was the best place for the party, that it would be a community event, and that denying Chad would be unneighborly. But before I could respond, Rachel stepped onto the porch in her uniform, badge glinting, arms crossed, and asked, "Is there a reason you're harassing my husband on our property?" And the way Karen's face twitched as she realized my wife wasn't just some passive spouse but the chief of police was priceless, though of course she recovered with a laugh and said, "Oh Rachel, we're just talking about prom plans," to which Rachel replied, "Then plan your prom somewhere else," before shutting the door in her face, and I thought that was the end of it. But if you know anything about Karens, it's that humiliation only makes them double down. The next morning, I found a letter slipped under our door, written in bold handwriting, stating that the HOA board had voted to use the cabin for prom and that my refusal would result in fines and potential legal consequences, which made me laugh out loud because the HOA had absolutely no jurisdiction over private property not included in the community bylaws. And our cabin had been in my family long before the HOA ever existed, so legally they didn't have a leg to stand on. But Rachel didn't laugh. She snapped a picture of the letter and filed it as harassment, muttering, "If she keeps this up, I'll charge her," which sent a chill down my spine because when my wife says something like that, she means it. Later that day, I went down to the cabin to check on it, just in case, and sure enough, I found beer cans scattered near the dock, footprints in the sand, and even a string of cheap plastic lights tangled in the trees, and it didn't take a detective to realize Chad and his buddies had already started using the place without permission. So I called Rachel, who showed up with 2 officers, and together they documented everything, removed the kids who were loitering, and issued warnings. But instead of stopping the madness, this only escalated things, because that evening Karen stormed into the HOA meeting. One Rachel happened to attend undercover as a homeowner rather than as chief, and began ranting about how I was selfish and un-American for refusing to let the youth celebrate their milestones, whipping up the crowd into a frenzy, though half the neighbors rolled their eyes because they'd dealt with her antics for years, while the other half were too scared to oppose her. And then she dropped the bombshell. She claimed she had special permission from the county sheriff to host the party at our cabin whether we liked it or not, which was not only a lie but a dangerous one. Because Rachel immediately stood up, identified herself as chief of police, and said flatly, "That's not true," which silenced the room like someone had cut the power, and Karen's face went crimson as Rachel added, "If you trespass on my husband's family property again, you'll be arrested," and you'd think that would have ended it. But no, Karen was not done. 2 nights later, just a week before prom, I drove by the cabin again and noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud, so I parked quietly down the road and crept through the trees, only to discover Chad and his football buddies unloading cases of beer and boxes of decorations into the cabin, having somehow broken the lock, and as I pulled out my phone to call Rachel, Chad spotted me and swaggered over, beer in hand, saying, "You can't stop us, old man. My mom says this place is ours for the night," and I replied calmly, "We'll see what your mom says when the police show up," and that's when he made the mistake of shoving me, sending me stumbling back, and unfortunately for him, Rachel and 2 patrol cars arrived just in time to see it happen, lights flashing, sirens cutting through the night, and within minutes Chad and his buddies were being cuffed for trespassing, vandalism, and underage drinking, while Karen came screeching down the road in her SUV, screaming that we were ruining her son's future, demanding the officers release him, but Rachel stood her ground and said, "Ma'am, step back or you'll be arrested too," and Karen, in her infinite audacity, actually tried to snatch the handcuff keys from an officer's belt, which resulted in her being restrained and placed in the back of a squad car, shrieking the entire time about lawsuits and conspiracies, and though the kids were released to their parents with citations, Karen herself spent the night in county jail, which made the local news under the headline, "HOA President Arrested for Disorderly Conduct," and the fallout was nothing short of glorious, because the HOA board quickly voted her out. Neighbors began sharing their horror stories about her bullying, and within a month she resigned and moved out of the neighborhood entirely, leaving behind a for sale sign and a trail of gossip, while Chad, stripped of his prom king title and grounded for the rest of the year, slunk into obscurity, no longer the golden boy but the cautionary tale parents whispered about, and as for Rachel and me, we finally got our peace back, spending weekends at the cabin without fear of entitled neighbors, and though it took a chaotic week of drama, I'll never forget the satisfaction of watching justice play out, proving once and for all that no matter how loud a Karen shouts, it doesn't matter when the chief of police is on your side, and every time I sit on the dock now, watching the sun dip below the trees, I can't help but smile and think, too bad for you, Karen, you picked the wrong neighbor to mess with.